BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. The Zodiac was a serial killer that operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop something down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and that's really good if you want to send things like attachments. And I am your host, Box Ned. The first thing I would like to discuss with you guys is, of course, the announcements, and there is loads of Zodiac Killer content available on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, which is run by Jerome from Belgium. Feel free to tune into the panel discussion episodes, and if you haven't heard them all, there are a whole set of panel discussion shows where a group of us discuss the Zodiac Killer, once again on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. There's also lots of Zodiac content on New Cokes 2024, run by Vincent McConnell. I particularly liked his episode called True Crime Live Friday. And the first video that I would like to discuss with you guys is one that came out recently, and it's called The Terrifying Truth of the Zodiac Killer's Secret. And it's a video that was made available on the channel Mysterious and Unsolved Cases. Now, this is one that is not very popular, but as I was watching this video, they did address several specific points. And the first one is that the Zodiac Killer was not a normal serial killer, because the Zodiac challenged a lot of the expectations that people had about psychological profiling. And near the end of their video, they were just more or less pointing out that the Zodiac was a horribly inconsistent serial killer, and a lot of the beliefs that psychological profilers and criminal profilers and just everybody associated with analyzing criminal behavior approach the case with, everything they discussed and explored was not applicable to the Zodiac Killer. For example, the Zodiac's first crimes were the Lake Herman Road murders on December 20th of 1968 that saw the deaths of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. Then there was the murder of Darlene Ferrin on the 4th of July, 1969. The Lake Berryessa stabbing saw the death of Cecilia Shepard, and that occurred on September 27th of 69. And then the murder of Paul Stein, the taxi driver, which occurred on October 11th of that year. And they're very, very inconsistent crimes. And last week on the channel, I was talking about the differences between organized and disorganized offenders. And really, it appears that there is something that is extremely, extremely organized about three of these attacks, and that would be the Lake Herman Road murders, the Blue Rock Springs shooting, and the Stein murder, where it would just fit the techniques that I listed off by Joe Kennedy in his criminology book when he is talking about how and why criminals choose to behave the way they do. But everything about the Lake Berryessa stabbing is organized. Excuse me if I said organized and disorganized in the wrong order. The first three things I listed off, the first three crimes that I listed off, would be very disorganized crimes. The Lake Berryessa stabbing is an extremely organized crime. I want to be very clear about that. Organized because this is the type of killer that brought a kill kit. This is the type of killer that created this type of elaborate ruse, that wore a very specific costume to the Zodiac crime scene. This is the only time that the Zodiac wore his hooded costume at Lake Berryessa, and somebody even wrote in the comments section on a recent Zodiac Monday saying that me, Black Box Ned, is a kind of person that is not open to the possibility of multiple killers, and I always am. I always am. Over the years, I've definitely veered more toward a single perpetrator, and I've definitely veered more toward the possibility that these crimes are all committed by one person, and just that there could be a very simple explanation for the differences between Lake Berryessa and the other crime scenes that I have not been able to uncover, that we have not been able to uncover. This is an unsolved case, but I do want to be very clear. I am open to the possibility of multiple killers, and last week after Zodiac Monday, I really thought about it. The Lake Berryessa stabbing is so different. It's organized, and the other ones are disorganized. But there's a particular element of the case that I haven't explored too much because perhaps you could say I've dismissed a lot of the accusations that people have, allegations, rumors, gossip that people are spreading about the connections among the victims. And some people think that with a disorganized serial killer, that there might be some type of personal connection between the killer and the victims, but that other people think there might be connections among all of the victims, and that there were reasons why they were targeted. And I have been a little bit dismissive of that because I just think there's insufficient evidence. But there's a difference between a curiosity, but between being curious about something and actually having the evidence to back it up. And lately, I'm becoming much more curious, much more suspicious, and I'm highly entertaining the possibility more that not only was there some type of connection between the Zodiac and one or more of the victims, but perhaps there were specific reasons why these victims were targeted, that the killer was stalking the victims in some ways. A lot of people have talked about that in the past, and I haven't been the strongest voice to consider that, but it becomes a more likely possibility with each day. And the second thing that was discussed in the video, The Terrifying Truths of the Zodiac Killer's Secrets, is that there are some Zodiac Killer suspects that are widely discussed. And they are ones that you can find on zodiackiller.com. You can hear about them on various programs on YouTube. We just had this is the Zodiac Speaking documentary that is once again talking about Arthur Lee Allen. And this video that was on the Mysterious and Unsolved Cases channel is saying just that. There are two Zodiac Killer suspects that do not seem to go away. One of them is, of course, Arthur Lee Allen. I just mentioned him. And the second one they brought up was Lawrence Kane. And at first I was very surprised that they would say that, but I decided to mull it over for a whole 3 seconds, and then I decided, you know what, I think they're onto something. That Lawrence Kane is a widely discussed Zodiac Killer suspect. He enters into the conversations very frequently, and as somebody who does this Zodiac Monday segment, I can see that when people leave waves of comments about Lawrence Kane, maybe they saw something about him on the History Channel, a repeat episode, or maybe he was just entering into a different type of program. Usually there's a reason why certain suspects become more widely discussed, especially ones like Richard Hoffman and the previously mentioned Arthur Lee Allen. Maybe someone's making videos about them and they're getting a lot of exposure, but I do agree that Lawrence Kane is one suspect that just won't go away. I said that I was surprised to hear that because Arthur Lee Allen is the prime suspect, I completely admit that, but I would think that even Richard Gaikowski is a more widely discussed suspect than Lawrence Kane. Maybe he's not the type of suspect in people's minds that would never go away. And I mean, we can go back to at least 1974 when Harvey Hines was looking at Lawrence Kane as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and it's possible that people were looking at Gaikowski all the way back to 1969, but in terms of being widely discussed and entering into discussions among sleuths, I mean, firstly, I will stand by that. I think Richard Gaikowski is a more widely discussed suspect. However, I also think that there is just something about Lawrence Kane that won't go away, and I don't think that Richard Gaikowski is ever going to leave the conversations. So he would definitely belong in that echelon of widely discussed suspects. Now, popular does not mean that any of these three men were actually the killer. And this is one of the reasons why I find it so hard to discuss the suspects continuously, because mostly I have doubts about all of them. And this video that was on the Mysterious and Unsolved Cases channel even brought up another one, Gary Francis Post. And Gary Post is someone whom I think is unlike Allen, Kane, and Gaikowski. I think Gary Post is going to fade from serious discussions in the near future. I don't know if we're talking about 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Unless the Zodiac Killer case is solved tomorrow or very soon, I think that there will be a lot of discussions about Gary Post for a little bit, and then he's going to fade away because people are going to realize that there is insufficient evidence to say that Gary Post was the Zodiac. Now, another idea that was mentioned in this episode was that there was something about Gary Post where he wasn't even entertained by law enforcement as being the Zodiac. And I'm not completely sure that's true. They didn't cite a source on that law enforcement never entertained Gary Post as a Zodiac suspect. And I would expect, based on the amount of coverage that went into looking at Gary Post, that he was perhaps considered, even if it was for a moment, or that law enforcement would at least want to know who is this person, and that some people in law enforcement would begin to just get that moment of curiosity versus evidence that I was just talking about, and they would want to analyze the substance material. But that is, again, just what I would expect happened, and at the very least, Gary Post has entered into a lot of serious Zodiac Killer discussions, although I confess that people who closely follow the case are very quick to realize that the evidence that has been brought forward for Gary Post's involvement in the Zodiac case, such as the scars on the forehead, or that he was a radar technician and the center of his radar machine would have resembled the Zodiac symbol, or just the fact that he was a skilled cryptographer in the Air Force, allegedly, is just not enough evidence to say that he was the Zodiac Killer. Partnered with the anagram solutions that I was discussing recently, there's just insufficient evidence to say that Gary Post had anything to do with the Zodiac murders. There's also a video out there called A True Crime Mystery That Defies Time, and this is on the Deadly Secrets channel, and of course it is discussing the Zodiac Killer, and it is one that is really trying to get more into the psychological aspects of the Zodiac case. And what this video begins by saying is that the Zodiac had a particular desire for control, and a lot of us know that, right? But the Zodiac had this type of desire to maintain control over life and death. That's really what the Zodiac Killer wants. And as a case in point, they point to the 408 cipher that says, "When I die in paradise, I will be reborn, and those whom I have killed will be my slaves," something to that effect, meaning that perhaps the only ounce of genuine psychological interpretation that could be associated with that statement is that the Zodiac wants to have power over life and death. And the next part of it is that the Zodiac enjoys being mysterious. He enjoys developing this type of mystery, and he wants the mystery to keep going. And the reasons why they're saying this is because he wants to just be the enigma, because it's all about him, and he can know the truth and no one else can. It's the center of attention. It's very narcissistic, and it's also very pathetic in a lot of ways because he's an attention seeker. But this same video, A True Crime Mystery That Defies Time, asked a challenge question to the audience, and you guys know that I can't resist challenge questions. And this one says, was the Zodiac a master manipulator? And of course, they may have phrased it in a different way, but it's something that they did bring up and they did ask the audience, was the Zodiac a master manipulator? And I think their answer to this challenge question was yes. They think that the Zodiac was someone who actually was able to pull off certain types of master manipulations. Do I think that the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s was a master manipulator? No, absolutely not. Was he a manipulator? Yes. But was he a master manipulator? No. And here's the following reason. The Zodiac made all types of threats about, if people don't do what I say, I'm going to make them pay. But he didn't do that. He didn't follow through on the threats, and furthermore, people didn't do what the Zodiac Killer wanted. The Zodiac was begging for front page coverage from the newspapers. He didn't get it. He even complained in one letter that he's writing to the LA Times because they don't bury him on the back pages. The Zodiac also made requests and demands for people to wear Zodiac Killer buttons, to wear nice Zodiac Killer buttons. And then people aren't doing it. So he's like, oh, wait, well, wear some not so nice buttons. Wear any type of Zodiac Killer buttons. Just pay attention to me and do what I want. The Zodiac made numerous requests, and he made threats. He said all kinds of things where he was trying to demand things from the public, from the press, and perhaps even the police, and people just didn't follow through on them. So to say that the Zodiac Killer was some type of master manipulator, if anything, they viewed him as an annoying troll that they had to take seriously because, as I said, he was a manipulator, but there's nothing brilliant and there's nothing extraordinary about what he was doing. He's just saying, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to kill people. So the newspapers had to listen to what he was doing. They had to listen to what he was saying and watch what he was doing. And this is the whole reason why the FBI got involved in the first place, because the Vallejo Times-Herald, one of the newspapers that the Zodiac Killer wrote to, got in touch with the FBI for extortion. They were saying that, hey, this guy's saying that if we don't print his message in the paper, then he's going to go on a kill rampage. That's extortion. But, like, the Zodiac Killer didn't even get front page coverage everywhere like he demanded. So he's not a master manipulator. I think it's a good challenge question, though, and if anything, it gets the wheels turning in one's brain all the same. But as far as the Zodiac Killer's actions go, they had a follow-up challenge question and that was, did the Zodiac control his narrative? And I think that for the most part, the Zodiac did control a lot of things about his narrative. And I think the reason why is because he was extremely vague. When the Zodiac is writing in these letters that just have numbers written at the bottom, me 37, people are going to say, oh, the Zodiac's claiming 37 victims. That's why he wrote that. Other people think that there are completely different reasons why he wrote the number 37. Some people think that he was 37 years old at the time. And there are just numerous possibilities about why you could find the number 37. But the Zodiac did control a lot of his narrative, also because he would mail in greeting cards and some of the ciphers which haven't even been solved. And if you want to hear more about the ciphers, particularly the Z13, I invite you to go over to the group The Search for Zodiac, which is run by Chad Burke, and he also does a regular Zodiac report inside his Facebook group, one more time, called The Search for Zodiac. But that's just an example of a cipher that has not been solved to this day, the Z13 and the Z32 cipher. And the Zodiac is saying that, okay, if you will solve these ciphers, you will have me, you'll get my identity. But in all seriousness, one of you guys in the comment section even wrote into the channel just saying that, all right, it's really good that the 340 cipher was solved in 2020, but that just showed us that the Zodiac Killer isn't leaving behind the types of clues and hints and messages that a lot of people expected that he would. Now, to be clear, David Orenschak was part of the team that solved the 340 cipher in 2020, and he was the person whom I interviewed, and that person left a comment in response to the interview with David Orenschak, and I think the person was trying to say David Orenschak did something very good with his efforts and contributions to helping solve the Z340, but this just goes to show that the ciphers are not going to lead to the Zodiac Killer's identity. And I think that perhaps that's true, except that there could be some type of hidden meaning, some type of double meaning, some type of very, very intricate, multi-layered solution that only the person who created it would be able to tell you about. That's something that I think would be in there. But one more time, the two videos that I've been talking about are called The Terrifying Truth of the Zodiac Killer's Secrets, and this was made available on the channel Mysterious and Unsolved Cases. And there is also one called A True Crime Mystery That Defies Time, and Zodiac Killer is also in the title of that, The Zodiac Killer, A True Crime Mystery That Defies Time, that is on the Deadly Secrets channel. Now, the next thing I would like to talk about is something that I should have done a long time ago, and it's revisiting the Zodiac Killer suspect Jim Mordecai. Jim Mordecai is the subject of the documentary The Truth About Jim, which is made available on Max, formerly known as HBO Max, and this came out earlier this year, and I don't have my own personal Max account, but somebody offered me their Max account back in February when this documentary came out, and they were asking me if I would discuss it on Black Box Online Radio. I had the opportunity to watch it back then, but I decided not to for a very particular reason. As you can see from the title of this episode, this is the Zodiac Killer News Report, and I began looking into Jim Mordecai as a Zodiac suspect prior to watching the docu-series, and I really wasn't seeing a lot of Zodiac-related material. I was seeing stuff like Jim Mordecai was a sex offender, he was a high school teacher and former football player, and his granddaughter was accusing him of being a serial killer, and specifically, she is the step-granddaughter. He was not a biological relative, he was a relative by marriage. And there was also a write-up for the show that said by the end of the docu-series The Truth About Jim, his granddaughter, whose name is Sierra Barter, didn't even agree with the conclusion that he was the Zodiac Killer. So I'm just reading all of these things about Jim Mordecai that just seemed like they were going in the absolute opposite direction. And I was just thinking, well, I don't see a lot of stuff that's Zodiac related. But there are a couple reasons why I decided to watch the documentary The Truth About Jim, which is a multi-part docuseries, once again available on Max. And the first one is that a lot of you guys were leaving comments on the channel about Jim Mordecai, just asking, what do you think about Jim Mordecai as a Zodiac Killer suspect? And also, I had the opportunity to interview Michael Butterfield recently, Michael Butterfield of ZodiacKillerFacts.com, and during that interview we talked a lot about the docuseries The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, but after the interview, Michael Butterfield asked me, "Did you watch my documentary, The Truth About Jim?" He didn't say it like that. He said, "Did you watch the documentary that I was featured in called The Truth About Jim?" And my answer was no, and it wasn't even just a no. I had forgotten that that thing even existed. And I interviewed Michael Butterfield last month and released the episode, but I had completely forgotten about this, so I thought, it's time to just sit down and revisit Jim Mordecai as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And the docuseries, The Truth About Jim, really takes a twofold approach to this particular mystery. No, let's do better than that. It takes a threefold approach for the following reasons. Number one, the entire beginning setup, like the first episode, the whole build-up is about how Jim Mordecai was a sex offender. He was someone with an explosive temper. He was a high school football star, and I do mean that. He wasn't just a high school football player. He was a star, and they even brought up a newspaper clipping showing that Jim Mordecai leads the football team to a 26-0 victory, and then he went on to become a high school teacher who would develop inappropriate relationships with his students. And this was not exactly expressed in the documentary, but I think that a key message that they were trying to convey and they were trying to communicate is that Jim Mordecai was someone who peaked in high school. He reached his social status peak during his high school years, being the football player, being the star of the team, and he just didn't want to walk away from that. So he went on to become a high school teacher and started trying to date high school girls. And the people in the town developed this very odd relationship with him where they would go out partying on Friday nights and maybe on other weekend nights too, like Saturdays or something, but they definitely said Friday nights in the show. And then when people would go out and get drunk, they would go over to Mr. Mordecai's house and they would get in the hot tub with him. The students would get in the hot tub with the teacher, or just teenagers would get into the hot tub with this teacher. And then multiple people ultimately ended up accusing Jim Mordecai of sexual assault or some type of misconduct, abusive behavior, and there really they want to be very clear in the documentary that there are multiple allegations against him, even though he has passed away. This takes another turn, because Sierra Barter would explore the possibility of how this person's behavior, Jim Mordecai's behavior, was very, very dangerous. He was extremely abusive. He liked rough sex. He was preying on students. Did he escalate to murder? And there were two stories that are explored in the documentary The Truth About Jim, and I think one of the reasons why they didn't call it Zodiac Killer Suspect Jim Mordecai, or the Zodiac Killer isn't mentioned in the title, is, again, they wanted to focus on the stories of the survivors, the victims, and the family members, but also they wanted to look at the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings and the Zodiac Killer mystery. And this is the stuff that Michael Butterfield really talked about in the documentary, just pointing out some of the major differences. The Zodiac Killer operated before the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings, and we're talking about 1968, 69, and 70. But one thing that was left out by the documentary crew, not from Michael Butterfield, but from the documentary crew themselves, is that the Zodiac Killer did write letters into 1971. Then in 72 and 73, the Zodiac isn't writing letters, but people, specifically females, were targeted in or around Santa Rosa, California, and this becomes known as the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings. And the victims were tied up and hogtied, and some of them were killed in other ways. The victims were carried hundreds of yards to disposal sites, and they were sexually assaulted. And, my honest takeaway from this documentary was something that I had going into it, so I don't really feel like I had any type of enormous revelation, but it was that Jim Mordecai seems like a reasonable suspect for the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings. He does not seem like a reasonable suspect for the Zodiac Killer murders, and Michael Butterfield was more or less not exactly on par with that. In short, he just pointed out about the extreme differences between the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings and the Zodiac Killer mystery, the sexual assaults, the way the victims were disposed, versus the Zodiac, who mostly just left the victims there. But I'm going to go out on a limb here And maybe I'm completely wrong about this. And if you have something to say, I want you to put it in the comment section down below. Tell me what you think. Tell me why you think that this is correct or incorrect. And that is that I think the only reasons why people are suspecting the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Slayer of being the Zodiac Killer are extremely simple. Number one, serial killer in Northern California. Number two, it explains the Zodiac Killer's absence of activity. He graduated from being someone who shoots couples parked in cars and writing letters to being a sex offender. And number three, the victims were hog-tied at Lake Berryessa, where their arms are tied to their legs and their feet, and they're tied behind their back. They were hog-tied at Lake Berryessa, and some victims in the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings were hog-tied. Now, this is an actual piece of evidence, and I do give credit to Sierra Barter and The Truth About Jim when they talked about how Jim Mordecai would make very inappropriate comments about how he wanted to hog-tie people, even if he's just play wrestling with someone saying, I want to hog-tie them, or even if it's done in an angrier way, saying that he wanted to hogtie them. The victims in the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slaying cases were hogtied. That is something that is worthy of consideration. You can't necessarily say that, oh my goodness, he's the prime suspect now, but you have a guy who's a sex offender in the area, high school teacher, and you also have someone who is talking about doing things to the victims that were actually done to the victims, doing things to people that were actually done to the victims, rather. Yes, I'm definitely going to hear somebody out. But a big challenge that Sierra Barter encountered when she was bringing her evidence to people is that she would talk to psychological profilers, and they would just be like, all right, well, why do you think that your suspect or person of interest was the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayer? And they would say, she would say, well, he was living in this place, and he had a ranch that was in his family name that was in this place, and it occurred near some of the murders. And they're like, what? What? That's it? Well, he was a high school teacher. He interacted a lot with students, and he did some inappropriate things with them. What? What? They're like, that's it? And it's a very, very almost skeptical approach that was taken by the experts, as Sierra Barter brought her findings to. And, more power to them. More power to these profilers and these experts that were evaluating the material, because they didn't just cozy up to her and they didn't just tell her things for the camera. They were ultimately like, we think that you need more evidence than this. But there are certain points that are worthy of consideration for Jim Mordecai being the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayer. Now, as far as connections to the Zodiac murders, I also think that there is maybe one or two points where we can actually say that Jim Mordecai would be a reasonable suspect. He is doing inappropriate things with teenagers. He has some problems with controlling his urges, and the first two victims in the Zodiac murders were teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. I mean, in terms of the type of victim that he might target. But I do have another problem with that, and that relates to this thing that I do want to strongly challenge. And as you see, I've been trying to be very, very gracious and considerate of Sierra Barter's research and her decision to come forward and go public with Jim Mordecai as a suspect in the Zodiac Killer mystery, and the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings too, because she brought up a very, very strong issue in the documentary series, The Truth About Jim. And that was that, doesn't it seem like someone who is extremely violent and someone who's a sex offender and is talking about doing violent things to people would escalate their crimes to murder? And is someone going to do things like that? And my answer to that is no, not necessarily. There is no reason to immediately suspect that. Yes, some people start out by becoming abusers, but just because someone is an abuser, does that mean that they are homicidal? I mean, let's examine this. Let's really talk about this, and let's look at this subject. Are all sex offenders homicidal? No. Are all inappropriate teachers homicidal? No. Are all angry people at home homicidal? No, they are not. So there is not a real correlation that I believe that goes from being a sex offender to being a homicidal serial killer targeting multiple multiple victims. I mean, we're talking about numerous victims in the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slaying cases. We're talking about 5 murders in the Zodiac Killer case. Just because someone was a teacher who did inappropriate things with his students and then even escalated that to committing sex offenses, that does not mean he escalated to being a serial killer. And I'm going to come back to that point later on in the episode. But I do think that it's just important to note that there are different aspects of psychology, and this is all stuff that is related to being a serial killer and a serial offender with domestic abuse. And this is purely for the discussion on psychology. With domestic abuse, there are progressions in the severity of violence. And I heard this on TLC, the wonderful TLC, the Learning Channel, right? Well, I learned something from them, and that is that domestic violence is progressive. If someone is capable of yelling at you, they're capable of slapping you. If someone is capable of slapping you, they're capable of punching you. If someone is capable of punching you, they're capable of kicking you. If someone is capable of kicking you, they're capable of stomping on you. And if someone is capable of stomping on you, they're capable of killing you. Domestic violence has a very clear correlation with increases in physical abuse as well as the prone nature of being homicidal. It escalates toward a homicidal direction. But I have to go back to everything that I said previously, talking about serial killers. Not all sex offenders are serial killers, not all rapists are serial killers, and not all inappropriate teachers are serial killers. So I just wanted to be very clear that there are different aspects of psychology that do need to be explored. And right now I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. You can support this channel with buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And our first shout out comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. And we have something here as well from Batman66. I have to give credit to him for sharing with me the title of the book, Crime in the Mind, an outline of psychiatric criminology, and this was written by Dr. Walter Bromberg. And it's going to be a book that I'm going to explore in the future, but I decided to pull up some book reviews and some of the notes that were written for this book, and I also wanted to just look at some things that people had to say, and I found one article that was written about it in the journals from the University of Chicago. It's just called Chicago Journals, actually, and it says, "The bulk of the book is devoted to the relation of abnormal mental states to delinquency. The author takes up various types of psychopathic personalities, paranoids, schizoids, chronic alcoholics, drug addicts, and the like, and shows their importance in understanding criminal behavior. He analyzes the patterns of the aggressive psychopaths, the psychopathic swindlers, and the psychopathic sex criminals. Then comes a very valuable section on emotional immaturity." Okay, that is a very small piece of text that you just heard that is talking about this book, Crime in the Mind, an Outline of Psychiatric Criminology by Dr. Walter Bromberg, and that is a write-up for the book. That's someone talking about the book. But what's the takeaway from that? There's a reason why I wanted to do the supporter shoutouts right after this Truth About the Gym segment. Everything that you just heard in that little segment is related to what I was talking about with the Truth About Jim. Not all types of abusive offenders are the same. Not all types of homicidal offenders are the same. Let's look at some different types of abusive offenders. There are aggressive psychopaths. There are psychopathic swindlers. There are psychopathic sex criminals. Even that alone, aggressive psychopaths versus aggressive sex criminals versus psychopathic sex criminals. I mean, just because someone is a sex criminal, it does not mean they are a psychopathic serial killer. Just because someone is a psychopathic sex criminal, it does not mean that they are going to escalate their behavior to physical violence. And that was something that just immediately connected everything to me together. Thank you, Batman66, for sharing that. And our next supporter shoutout comes to us from River Prawn Pottery, another regular and consistent supporter. You guys are absolutely amazing. And there's another regular and consistent supporter that has joined the ranks, and that is CZ Guy. CZ Guy has also become very regular here on Zodiac Monday. And again, you can support this channel with buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And you can also use the super chats when I go live and the super thanks here on YouTube. Now, if you guys have been following the Zodiac Monday episodes, you'll know that I've been going through the book Obsessed by Mark Hewitt. The full title is Obsessed, My Relentless Pursuit of the Zodiac Killer. And one thing that is discussed in that book is a challenge question. I've already said it before, I love challenge questions. And it's something that I would like to ask you. What countries has the Zodiac Killer visited? And let's phrase this in perhaps a more appropriate terms. Prior to the Zodiac Killer's set of homicides in 1968 and 69, what countries do you think he had visited? You can put your ideas on the comment section down below, and I had to think about it for a second, because I also had to think about a lot of my own assumptions and in the past that were wrong. And when this is discussed in the book Obsessed, My Relentless Pursuit of the Zodiac Killer, Mark Hewitt is talking about conversations that he had with a friend, and they're going over this, and they're exploring different possibilities, and I've done that in the past. Here's a point where I've mostly taken a step back from, and again, you guys who have followed the Zodiac Killer news reports over the years will know that I used to be 100% certain that the Zodiac Killer was in Spain at some time. Not 100%, 99%. The Zodiac Killer went to Spain, and he was stationed at the U.S. Spanish military base in Cadiz, Spain, and that the Lake Berryessa hood was based on a Spanish capirote hood, and that he actually obtained one in Cadiz, Spain. And yes, the black capirote hoods are worn in Cadiz. I had never heard of Cadiz, Spain before I was reading about this, and I went down a giant rabbit hole, and there's even a book that's written about them and so on that I was trying to interview the author of it. But I had to take a step back and be like, the hood that the Zodiac Killer wore at Lake Berryessa, the black hood with the rectangular top and the Zodiac symbol, was most likely a modified executioner's hood. Maybe it was from the theater, maybe it was from some type of historical display, but I was like, it's probably a modified executioner's hood. And I'm no longer 99% certain that the Zodiac Killer was in Cadiz, Spain. However, let's look at some more realistic possibilities. Which countries had the Zodiac Killer visited prior to becoming the quote-unquote Zodiac? Well, Vietnam is extremely likely. I mean, we have the Vietnam War going on in the 1960s and 70s. Prior to 1968, this is the Vietnam era. And especially when you look at other criminal cases that are going on side by side or after the Zodiac crimes that took place, let's say D.B. Cooper, for example. When I was looking at psychological profiles of D.B. Cooper, particularly the ones created by Dr. David G. Hubbard, it's just that you're hearing D.B. Cooper was a Vietnam vet who was disgruntled, and from time to time we get this in the Zodiac Killer world. There are suspects who are Vietnam vets, but, I mean, the Zodiac Killer could have been stationed in Vietnam. That's entirely possible. And depending on the Zodiac Killer's age, also Korea. I mean, the Korean War happened in the early 1950s. Vietnam came later, but I mean, depending on his age, he could have been stationed in Korea. And some people even have Zodiac Killer suspects that were World War II veterans. The first one that comes to mind is Shel Cavalli, who was a World War II naval pilot. And yes, there are a lot of other suspects that are World War II veterans. The older ones, of course, because the Zodiac didn't start operating until 1968. But World War II, that could be anywhere across Europe, or the Pacific Theater in Japan, as well as the islands. I mean, all types of countries that are now independent along the Pacific. But I would go with Vietnam if I had to say, was the Zodiac Killer ever outside of the United States? And he was in Vietnam. Now, some people insist that the Zodiac Killer was British. Other people insist that the Zodiac Killer was Canadian, and again, I'm not seeing a lot of evidence that really pulls me that way. I'm seeing evidence that is much stronger toward the military connections. And what's the military doing in 1968 and 69? The Vietnam War. But what do you think? Which countries had the Zodiac Killer visited prior to becoming the Zodiac? Now, the next thing I have for you here on the Zodiac Killer News Report is a completely different piece of material, and I'm a little bit reluctant to share this with you because it is extremely different, and there was a performance that was done called Mom's Last Words, And it's the story of a woman confessing to have been the Zodiac Killer. A woman's confessing to being the Zodiac Killer, and it's as if she died, and she is sending a message back to the people that she knew in her life that she was indeed the Zodiac Killer. And I'm going to play the audio for this, and you can find this on YouTube, once again, under the name Mom's Last Words, Zodiac Killer. And there is a reason why I'm going to play this, because it's going to start out just as a pure theatrical performance, but as somebody in the comment section pointed out, it seems like they did a fair amount of research for when they were writing the script, whoever wrote it, and I'm not sure of the exact author of this one, but it seemed like they put a lot of thought and effort into composing the text that you're going to hear and the words that you're going to hear from this performance. So without further ado, I'm going to let you guys listen to Mom's last words, and then let's respond.
Hello, my name is Patricia Brandt, and if you're watching this, I am dead. I wanted to make this video for my loved ones in an effort to leave nothing unsaid. So first of all, to my beautiful children, Tim and Carol, I want you to know how proud I am of you and how deeply I love you. Also, I'm the Zodiac Killer. It was me. Hundreds of thousands of human hours have been spent trying to find my identity. But they never for a second considered that I might be a woman. So, I mean, think about it. The hallmarks of the whole Zodiac thing are meticulous little handwriting, chatting on the phone, and astrology. Come on. Anyhow, to my sister Laura, thank you for always taking care of me and for asking no questions when I asked you to burn all those ropes. Listen, do you know that the best profilers in the world have never been able to find a single link between the Zodiac victims? You want to know what they had in common? They all personally wronged me. Okay, so the first couple, they were rude diners at a restaurant where I was a spiteful young waitress. Bang, bang. The second couple, that was kind of a classic love triangle situation where she was in love with him, he was in love with her, I was the Zodiac. Bang, bang. The third couple actually were friends of mine from community college. Or so I thought. But then they didn't invite me to their 4th of July party. Hog tie, stab, 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 stab. Oh, didn't care for that at all. Very messy, completely unpleasant, never again. To Charlene, my lifelong best friend and forever bridge partner. I love you. Listen, did you know the cops arrived at the scene less than 2 minutes after I killed Paul? I was sitting right there eating cashews and cutting up a newspaper. A police officer came over to me and asked if I've seen a man fleeing the scene. No, officer. I haven't seen a man. But I guess they didn't really pay attention to me because they were too busy looking for this guy. This rendering is so unbelievably rude. I'm sorry. I guess I was the only young woman in 1969 who saw Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby and got tricked into thinking I could pull off a pixie cut. To this day, that haircut is my greatest regret. Anyhow, what else? I'd like to be cremated, and please play some Petula Clark at my service. The David Fincher Zodiac movie is junk, but Ruffalo and Gyllenhaal? Oh, folks can knock it off with all the Ted Cruz stuff. He's not involved, though I do, of course, think he's a wonderful senator. And oh my God, everyone go back and take a second look at my Christmas cards. You will be kicking yourselves. All right. Well, finally, to all the little girls out there, I just want to give you my advice for living a long, happy life. Do the crossword every day. Never hold on to a grudge. And don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't violently wipe souls off the surface of this earth at will. You can do anything you put your mind to.
And one more time, that was the performance Mom's Last Words, talking all about the Zodiac Killer and the possibility of the Zodiac Killer being a woman. And I mean, I think that if this were the Jack the Ripper case, they wouldn't even make a performance like that, because the theory that Jack the Ripper was a woman is widely discussed. It's called the Jill the Ripper theory, and I have a standalone episode about that here on this channel, which I invite you to listen to. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to hear about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and T.B. Cooper. But also, when she was talking about this, I do want to point out that some people have entertained the possibility of a woman being involved with the Zodiac crimes, and I mean, the female elements in the Zodiac mystery are discussed in different ways. Normally, the woman gets accused of being involved in the planning process, but you can hear this woman who's putting on a fictional performance, a satirical performance. This is not meant to be taken seriously, but she is saying that the female was the killer herself, and I didn't find this funny at all, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure why the audience is laughing. I'm not sure why the audience just thinks that it is so funny to hear these things about how, this person got away with murder, because the real Zodiac Killer was very pathetic in a lot of ways. And did you hear that thing, though? This is not about the word pathetic, but did you hear the part in there when she says that there's some clues that would give it away that the Zodiac Killer was a woman? I mean, talking on the phone, and the messages, and the handwriting, and all of that stuff. Okay, let's zone in on that. I think, and astrology, that's the other one, right? Firstly, the Zodiac Killer didn't always use neat handwriting, but I think she meant the ciphers are very neat, and there are phone calls and astrology. This all comes back to being an estrogen-centered personality. And again, I talk a lot about the governing components of brain chemistry on this channel. Dopamine, testosterone, estrogen, and serotonin. Just because someone is estrogen-centered, it doesn't mean they have high estrogen levels or they're a woman. Estrogen-centered means that someone is thoughtful and they get more pulled into their own mind and getting lost in their own consciousness and so on. I would even view myself as an estrogen-centered person, and I'm a male. Lots of men are estrogen-centered, and again, it's not about the actual estrogen levels, it's just a way to label behavior. Yeah, I think the Zodiac Killer was like that. I think the Zodiac Killer was all about that, for the reasons that they listed off. And again, I could see that there was a very strong amount of thought that went into the creation of this performance for the following reason. They're talking about how the Zodiac Killer may have had a personal connection with the victims, that these killings were done because someone was committing revenge acts. And one thing that I meant to say was that it's not until 1974 that we really have behavioral profiling becoming the primary piece of evidence that is used to solve a serial killer murder mystery. And that was with the Montana child murders. And the Montana child killer was David Meyerhofer, and he was captured primarily because of behavioral profiling. And he was someone who went on to commit suicide in 1974 as well. He committed suicide in his jail cell, and he was a very different type of serial killer because he murdered children, he murdered an adult female, but he targeted victims whom he felt either had wronged him in the past or that represented someone or something that had wronged him in the past. He killed a member of a Boy Scout troop because he felt excluded from the troop years ago. And with the actions of the person in this performance, she's saying the same thing, that there were specific reasons why these people were targeted, and there was it's all just done about stalking the victims, and the killer knew the victims that were meant to have been murdered. Man, I don't know what you guys think about that, but I just thought it was an interesting. The person who created this definitely had some intelligence behind the performance, even though I don't find it funny at all. And even though how this person's talking to her best friend named Charlene, which I can only guess was a creation of Sherry Joe Bates and Darlene Ferrin, and they created the name Charlene. Again, I think this was something that was very well thought out, except for the fact that there's some weird things like the Lake Berryessa stabbing was when they weren't invited to a 4th of July party. I mean, that's not completely an error. That's not completely inconsistent. That's not purely an error because Brian and Cecilia maybe had a 4th of July party that we don't talk about a lot. But anyway, I just throwing that stuff out there. But there's this whole concept of no one ever thought to look for a woman, and that the person after the Stein murder was a woman, and that's how she got away with it. I think that if the Zodiac Killer mystery goes unsolved for another 50 years, the way that Jack the Ripper has been unsolved for 136 years, we're going to see a lot more female Zodiac theories. I don't think we're going to see a lot of female Zodiac theories in the near future. Not until years later, because a lot of people recognize that they're just extremely masculine evidence and stories and cases that are going on. I mean, all the evidence is pointing toward a male perpetrator, and I know you guys in the comment section and listening to this program in the audience are aware of that. It's just, I would love to know what you think. And firstly, did you find this performance funny? Did you think that it was inappropriate? I wouldn't say that it was meant to mock the victims, or even anything of the sort. I don't think it's funny to laugh at murder in this particular way, because the whole concept is, oh yeah, I'm a murderer and I didn't get caught. And like, well, what else is there to say? And I'm just kind of like exhaling air because I'm somewhat speechless at that. And one more thing that I have for you guys here on the Zodiac Killer News Report is that there are true crime cases that are solved all the time. There are mysteries that get answers all the time, and there are more and more breakthroughs in the world of forensic science. For example, we recently saw the murder of Kathy Holly from 1979 being solved. She was a woman who was sexually assaulted, and her body was found in a river after it had been there for 3 weeks, murdered in 1979, and there was a link to a serial killer named Bruce Lindahl. And there was a video that came out on the local news in her area that was I found on YouTube about this story, but I was just sitting back and I was watching it, and I was waiting for him. Like, how did they solve it? How do they solve it? I'm waiting for it. You know what I'm going to say. Everybody knows what I'm going to say. DNA evidence. You solve a crime like this because of DNA evidence. And I was like, yes, that's how this case was solved. The murder of Kathy Holly was linked to the serial killer Bruce Lindahl because of DNA. And with the Zodiac Killer mystery, the DNA is horribly questionable. We aren't even 100% certain if that is the Zodiac Killer's DNA. So where does that leave us? Well, some of you may have noticed that I've been following the channel True Crime News a lot, and True Crime News also has a podcast that is available on their website, and they released a YouTube video that was talking about how a murder went unsolved for 15 years. But there was a different piece of evidence that brought up a lot of leads that connected the police to the killer. Firstly, a man became under suspicion of murdering a woman, and they're zoning in on him. He's acting strange around the time of her death. Turned out it wasn't him. It turned out that a woman was murdered by another woman. How did they get her? She had confessed to someone shortly after the crime, and the confession came out 15 years later. Things like that are definitely possible, and maybe, some way, somehow, somebody knows things about the Zodiac Killer and they just have not come forward. And the final thing that I have for you guys on the Zodiac Killer News Report is going into the territory of film, because from time to time I talk about movies on Zodiac Monday. Recently I was talking to you guys about Tenebrae because someone was asking about a mystery movie that I personally liked. And these movie discussions can be somewhat beneficial in the true crime world. I mean, I watched The Dead Girl because of one of your recommendations, and I'm still discussing it on numerous Zodiac Mondays. And this Dead Girl is a movie that features Brittany Murphy. And I was on Instagram, and someone was listing off the top 10 Brittany Murphy movies, and people in the comment section were even saying, hey, you didn't list the dead girl. That should be number one. And I do agree with that. Of course, King of the Hill is Brittany Murphy's best performance, then maybe the dead girl. And yes, girl interrupted. But Brittany Murphy was actually cast in another serial killer movie called Cherry Falls. And it's not such a bad movie. It's just an incredibly predictable performance. And it's an incredibly predictable mystery. You're going to know who the killer is very early on, so there aren't a lot of surprises. That is called Cherry Falls, one more time. But two of you guys recommended the movie Memories of Murder, and this is a Korean film. And I have to give a shout out to Henrik, who first recommended it, and the second person was Andrew WVA. And Andrew WVA was the person who told me that it was available on Tubi. And Memories of Murder is about how there is a serial killer who is doing a lot of things that are very different than that of the Zodiac, and he is operating in an extremely pattern-based way, whereas the Zodiac doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The Zodiac is operating on dates that don't make sense, like there's no pattern with the days that he is choosing. There is no real pattern with the reasons why he's targeting his victims. As he said, some crimes by knife, some crimes by gun, targeting a lone male like Paul Stein, the taxi driver, tying up the victims at Lake Berryessa the only time he tied them up, wearing a hooded costume only one time. The Zodiac is an inconsistent serial killer. But in the movie Memories of Murder, they had a serial killer that was exclusively targeting females, that was operating on rainy nights, and after a particular song was played on the radio, and it's almost as if there was some type of request put in, or just there's this sad song killer element to it. Again, it's a fictional movie. And this type of behavior is definitely very good for the movies. I mean, it's a very entertaining movie, and I like a lot of these Korean dramas. I think that they're very good. By that, I don't mean the K-drama shows. I don't really follow those, but other Korean movies that I've watched have been Mother, I Saw the Devil, Soulmates even, which is just a sad movie, not really about crime and mysteries. But I think that there's a lot of symbolism in this movie, Memories of Murder, that really point toward a very, very specific conclusion. And I mean, I'm often like that. Even when I was watching the movie Parasite that had won big at the Oscars, I also thought there was a very specific conclusion. But I mean, that's just my take on the subject. And ultimately, I find that real life serial killers are not extremely pattern based. Real life serial killers do not follow these types of models that people create about how the first crime is unplanned and then they want to develop a pattern and then they stick to the pattern. No, serial killers can be all over the map. Some other things about the movie Memories of Murder were related to the use of enhanced interrogation techniques where they have a good cop and a bad cop and they're interrogating a suspect, and it seems like the person who's playing the role of the good cop is actually completely aware of what's going on, and he is more of the person who's in control of the situation, and he's knowing fully well that the bad cop is going to start abusing the person who's being interrogated. They even use the word torture in the film, and they do things to hide scratches on the victims' faces, and he's allowing the person playing the bad cop role to beat the people who are being interrogated. And this isn't necessarily discussed in the film, but those things are just ridiculous because when people are under torturous conditions, they're more likely to confess to something that they didn't do, simply because they want the torture to stop, even to the point where they're telling the police not to yell at suspects or persons of interest while they're interrogating them, because, number one, they might give away or they might confess to something that they didn't do. Number two, they might give the impression that they are lying. And there's also this scene in the movie Memories of Murder where someone is just trying to assess someone's ability to tell the truth or not based on looking into their eyes. That is also ridiculous when you're dealing with a psychopathic serial killer, because psychopaths can fool people with by knowing what the telltale signs of lying are, and they can lie convincingly, and they can hide it, and they can change their facial expressions to do things in a convincing way. So that is also not reliable. Like looking into people's eyes, listening to their tone of voice, and just mannerisms and someone's eye movements, those are not real lie detectors, in my unprofessional opinion. But I was talking about this on a recent episode of True Crime Talk Radio about how there is another movie with a very similar title, and I looked it up because I've discussed it before on Black Box Online Radio, and it was called Memories of a Murder, not Memories of Murder, but Memories of a Murder, and that's the one that was about a girl who has the genetic predisposition to becoming a serial killer. Like, she has the serial killer gene in her family. And I mean, it's an entertaining movie all the same. It's not as heavy as Memories of Murder, the Korean film. But I would like to thank everybody for their movie recommendations, and thank you so much for listening to this Zodiac Monday. And you guys know where to find the show. There is a Facebook page for Black Box Online Radio, and you can also get my personal Facebook page, Ned Dahan, if you want to keep in touch. And there is a write-up for this show on ZodiacKillerCode.com. ZodiacKillerCode.com. And of course, you can download the audio version of this program for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts, under the name Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And you guys know about Instagram, blackboxonlineradio. That's another great way to keep in touch, as well as following along with other types of true crime content. And as always, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. And I will see you in the future. Goodbye.